Okay, so let's start with the second part of the section. Please do remind to silence all your microphones so that there's no interference with the session. And with further ado, let's start the presentation. So we have talked about the general concepts of the regulation. And we described the legal framework, the definitions, the classification, the conformity assessment procedure, and we also talked about specific new concepts brought up by the regulations. Okay, so not what are we going to talk about now? Now we're going to focus on the technical documentation. Okay, first we're going to talk about the milestones to this CE marking, and it will be a brief slide which will lead us to the technical documentation. Okay, then we will talk a bit about the technical documentations and then about the technical documentation sections in specific. You can see here in black the sections we're gonna focus on, and then in light gray the ones we're not gonna talk about in detail, because obviously the device description and design and manufacturing are quite specific to each device. So we're gonna focus on the others, okay, which are more general, let's say. So let's go first with the milestones to CE marking. What is the usual process to undergo to start this CE marking? Well, first we should qualify our device, which means we've got to assess if our device is a medical device or it's a medicinal product or a cosmetic. Okay, so once we identify that our device is a medical device, what we will do is classify. Okay, we will follow the rules that we mentioned before, and we will identify which class of device we're dealing with. Okay, this is a quite important step because obviously you've got to identify which regulation applies to your device. So you've got to determine if you've got a medical device or a medicinal product or whatever. You've got to do it early on. Okay, and it's quite important because there are certain, as we were talking before, that there are certain products that are quite borderline, so it's quite complicated to determine which regulation should be ruling over your product. Okay, so once you identify that your device is a medical device indeed, what you should do is you should go to the general safety performance requirements checklist. That means you've got to go to Annex 1 of medical devices regulation or in vitro diagnostic regulation and determine which requirements are applicable to your device. Okay, here in this Annex 1, you have all the information, all the annexes. Okay, once you identify all the applicable annexes, you'd go to the standards and guidelines. What does that mean? Once you know what you have to comply with, you've got to look for a way to demonstrate you comply with that requirement. How are you going to do it? Well, most likely you will follow certain standards or guidelines. So that's what you have to do here. Once you have identified your requirements, you go to the standards and guidelines. Once you have identified what standards you should follow, then you go to device testing and verification, because now you know how to test your device to demonstrate compliance with the regulation. So what to do? So once you have tested your device, you follow on with the clinical evaluation or the performance evaluation. This is a quite important thing to distinguish. When we talk about medical devices, we will talk about clinical evaluation. And when we talk about in vitro diagnostics, we will talk about performance evaluation. Okay. So once you have tested your device, you will proceed with the clinical evaluation or the performance evaluation, depending on your device, and you will follow it by a risk assessment. Okay, because you'll have to demonstrate that your device has a better, a positive balance when you place benefits and risks one against the other. Okay, so the next step you will do is compile your technical documentation and implement your quality management system. As we said before, it's important, it's, well, actually not important, it's mandatory for the manufacturer to have a quality management system in place to control the manufacturer of this device. And it's got to be a safe device and a device that performs adequately according to what it's supposed to do. And so it shall be protected by a quality management system. Okay, and once you have all this technical documentation and the quality management system in place, you would undergo CE marking. So why do we talk about this right before talking about technical documentation? Well, as we said, we were going to talk about this in the second section, but this technical documentation already includes information about all these other points. Okay, so we're going to go point by point talking about it, and all this information is going to be end up gathered in a single technical document. Okay. Regarding the device qualification and classification, that's the things we talked in the first section of this training. Okay, the kind of product you're dealing with and the classification. Okay, so now that we have this in mind, like which are the milestones to develop a medicinal product, a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic medical device, let's focus on the technical document we have to gather, which is the pillar which will sustain our device. Okay. So how is a technical document organized? Well, we've got several sections. Here we've got the main sections, and here you've got a color pattern. In blue, you can see the parts that are described by Annex 2 of the regulation. And then in orange, you can see the post-market surveillance, which is in Annex 3 of the regulation. Okay. So what should be included in the technical documentation? Obviously, the description and specification of the device, all the information supplied by the manufacturer, which includes the instructions for use or any labeling. That's all has to be included there. The design and manufacturing of the device, which explains how the device was designed, which protocols were followed to design this device, and obviously how the device is manufactured. This section changes quite a lot depending on on the device you're trying to develop. So we're not going to enter in detail in this section. Okay. Then we've got the general safety and performance requirements, which is something applicable to all the devices. All devices have to identify which requirements they have to comply with, and then they've got to demonstrate compliance with said requirements. And we've got the risk management, which is also applicable to all kinds of devices. In this section, what you would do is determine which risks can affect the safety and the performance of your device, which causes can lead to certain malfunctions, and which could be the consequences, and how you're going to mitigate them. We're going to talk about this later on. Then we've got product verification and validation, post-market surveillance, and then, as we said before, you have to include the EU Declaration of Conformity. Okay. Obviously, the technical documentation shall also include administrative information such as who's the manufacturer, addresses, contacts, authorized representative, imported distributors. All this information obviously needs to be included within the technical documentation. So, what are we going to focus on? We're going to focus on these points that have a star here. We will start with the information to be supplied by the manufacturer. Then we will move on to general safety and performance requirements, the risk management, the product verification, which will include several subsections like usability or biocompatibility. And then we'll talk a bit about post-market surveillance. As we were saying before, all these activities have to be gathered around a quality management system. Okay, it's important that the manufacturer has a quality management system in place that shall be based on ISO 13485. Okay. So the information to gather to the technical document. Where is it located? What are the requirements as stated in the regulation? Well, we've got in Annex 1, you've got the general safety and performance regulation requirements. Sorry. Then on Annex 2, we've got the technical document. The Annex 3, we've got the PMS content. Okay, so if you need to assess what information should be included in your technical document, you can go to either of these three annexes, because this is the information that is expected for you to have for your device. It doesn't matter what kind of device you have. It doesn't matter if it's a class A, a class 1, or a class 3. You have to compile with a technical document with this information. Obviously, it is stated which kind of information has to be included depending on the class of your device. If it's a class 1, it's quite not likely to include a clinical investigation, so that will not be included. So you have to assess depending on your device. Okay, but in general, you've got all the information laid out here in these annexes, indicating what information has to be included in the technical document. So this technical document, as we said, has to be controlled by this quality management system, and it should be a clear, organized, and readily searchable document, okay? Which has to include, as we said, the elements listed in Annex 2. This is laid down in the regulation, okay? It's got to be quite clear. So before we move on to the specific sections, let's talk about a bit the language and the structure of this technical documentation. This technical documentation usually has a core documentation, which is structured in several sub-chapters, okay? These chapters include information corresponding to different annexes, okay? The core of the technical documentation is usually in English, which is a language that is commonly accepted by the notified bodies. It is true that there are specific information that has to be supplied in diverse languages. In which languages, you may wonder? Well, it's in the languages of the countries where you're going to market your device. For instance, let's say if you're going to market your device in France, Italy, and Germany, you will need translations of certain documents to French, Italian, and German. Okay. So we can see here the specific documents that you have to translate. For instance, annexes that have to be translated to English. Nevertheless, they always have to be there in English so as to be able to be checked by a notified body. The GSPR checklist, the risk analysis, the usability, the clinical investigation data, or the biocompatibility are translated to English. Then on the other hand, the things that works the other way around are the instructions for use, which you will usually see here abbreviated to IFU, and the label. These have to, as we were saying, these have to be provided in every national language where the device is marketed. Okay, take into account that even though CE marking allows you to place a device in any country of the European Economic Area, maybe the manufacturer doesn't intend to market the device in all the countries. Okay, do you have to provide translations to all national languages? No, only to those where you want to market your device. Okay, it's not the same case as medicinal products. Okay, usually in medicinal products, you've got if you're following a centralized procedure or something like that, you've got to provide with the national translations. Here, it's only in the countries you want to market. Okay, even though CE marking allows you to market it, sorry, in all the countries, you only have to translate according to the countries you're gonna market the device. And then besides that, you've got the summary of safety and clinical performance, okay, which should be translated to national languages again, such as the instructions for use on the label. But if it's specific for healthcare professionals, it can be in English, okay? So now let's go in deep in the sections of the technical document. First, we're going to start with the information supplied by the manufacturer. And this information supplied by the manufacturer includes both the instructions for use and the label. Okay. So what this information should comply with is laid in Chapter 3 of Annex 1. Okay. If you remember, Annex 1 is the one that establishes all the requirements for the device. So in particular, within Chapter 3 of this annex, you've got the requirements for the instructions for use and the label. Okay. In general, what should the device comply with? What should the information provided with? Well, the format, content, and legibility and location of the information should be appropriate to the particular device, its intended purpose, and intended user. What does that mean? It's quite important when you're writing down the instructions for use or the label. It's important to keep in mind who is going to be using this device and for what. Okay, it's not the same to write instructions for use for a device that is going to be used by a patient, which may or may not have a formation on how to use this device, than writing them down for a doctor for a specific treatment. Okay, you always have to keep in mind the background of the final intended user. Okay, so it's not the same writing for a patient than writing for a doctor. And this is something that should be kept always in mind. The text cannot be super confusing or hard to understand for people without specific scientific background. Okay. So another general requirements are that labels shall be provided in human readable format and might be supplemented by machine readable information, which means it's not acceptable to place only a barcode or a QR code. You have to provide it in a way that a human can read it without the assistance of a machine. Okay. This might seem basic, but it's something you cannot forget about. So besides that, the instructions for use shall be provided with the device. Obviously, they have to be provided with each of the devices to be sold. It's true that if the packaging includes several devices, you must only provide with one instructions. But as a general rule, with each device, you should provide with instructions for use. And it's important to keep the residual risks tracked in the instructions for use. What does that mean? We will see later on that once you perform a risk analysis and a risk management task, obviously there will be always a residual risk that you may not be able to minimize or mitigate anymore. Even though it's low, there's a residual risk. So you've got to include this potential risk in the instructions for use. For instance, if your device can cause an allergic reaction, you've got to place it on the instructions for use. Obviously, this has to be minimized, and the balance of benefit risk ratio always has to be positive. That the risk cannot be higher than the benefit the device provides. But these residual risks should be included in the instructions for use as limitations or contraindications or precautions or warnings. Okay, this is one of the requirements of the instructions for use on the label. So here we've got some examples on the information that should be supplied. This is I should make a disclaimer here. This is not a comprehensive list of all you have to include. These are just examples. Okay. So in the instructions for use, the name of the device should be included, obviously, and the intended purpose with clear specification of indications and contraindications and patient target group and intended user should be included in instructions for use. Obviously, the manufacturer's details or indications of special storage or handling conditions. As you may see, there's plenty of information that should be provided within these instructions for use. And as I said, all these specific points are listed in Chapter 3 of Annex 1, where all these points are listed one after the other. As well as for instructions for use, there are also particular information to supply in the label. Again, we've got here the manufacturer's details, the authorized representative we were discussing before. The name of this authorized representative should be included in this label. What does it mean? If the manufacturer is based from outside the European Union and it has to have an authorized representative, well, the people acquiring this device has to be able to see on the label who is acting as an authorized representative of this manufacturer that it's not based in EU. Okay, to see who is the legal responsible in Europe. Other examples of things that should be included in apologies in the label are the expiry date and the UDA and the UDI. Okay, we were talking about this UDI before. This should be included in the label. Okay, so besides these examples, there are two main technical standards which are used to prepare these documentation, this label, and these instructions for use. These are a standard 1041 and ISO 15223. Okay, these two are specifically addressed to assess which information should be supplied by the manufacturer of medical devices. So usually what you do is you follow these standards when preparing both these instructions for use and the label. Okay. There is also guidance documents from MedTech Europe, which you have the link here, which indicates which symbols should be used to indicate compliance with the medical devices regulation. Okay. So now let's talk about the general safety and performance requirements. So we said this is an exercise that should be done early in as a milestone of your development of the device. Okay, and these are all the requirements that are applicable to your devices. Here you've got in Annex 1, you have a list with all the applicable requirements, and you've got to assess one by one if they are applicable or not to your device. Okay. So when we place this C marking of conformity, means that your device complies with the applicable requirements of the regulation. Okay, so what we're saying with the C marking is my device fulfills everything that it's asked to fulfill of the regulation. So we've got three different sections. We've got Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 3. First, we'll talk about Chapter 1, which are general requirements. Okay, here we will have what we will have here. We will have points such as that design and manufacture of the device should be safe and effective. Okay, this is something applicable to all kinds of devices. Obviously, it's not the same when you've got a software, for instance, which the manufacturer is not the same, but you will have to talk about how you design this software to do what it does, instead of a more physical medical device such as an implant, where you will have to describe thoroughly how the device is prepared, how do you manufacture it, what are the components of your implants. Okay. Another general requirement is that the design should be ergonomic and use error proof. This is something we will talk about later on, about usability of the devices, but you've got to demonstrate that your device is ergonomic and use error proof. You also have to demonstrate that you're carrying a risk management assessment, and that you have a risk management plan in place, and then you're tracking all the risks and assessing the risks associated to your device. And this has to be maintained in a risk management file. Okay. Also, you will be asked for your device not to be affected by the transport and storage condition. That means your device has to be stable. You will have to perform stability studies to demonstrate that your device complies with this requirement. And then you've got that the device should be stress resistant, as we were saying, stability testing. Okay, as I was saying, these general requirements are applicable to all the devices. Obviously, there are particularities depending on your device, but this Chapter 1 is like the most general. Okay. Then we've got Chapter 2, which is more specific to each kind of device. Here we make a distinction between medical devices and IVDs, because it's not the same when we're talking about medical devices or IVDs. Okay, so here in this slide we talk about medical devices, and we've got all the general safety and performance required associated to the design and manufacturing of medical devices. Okay, examples we've got here. Well, safety and performance by design. You've got to design your device so as it is safe from its conception. Okay. Biological safety, you've got to test biocompatibility of your device, obviously. Substances of concern, you've got to see if your device has leachables or extractables, or substances that could have an adverse effect on the patient. You've got to assess if your device includes or doesn't include medicinal substances which are ancillary. Let's remember, I know I insist in this point a lot, but it's quite important to remember. Your medical device can incorporate medicinal substances, but they cannot be driving the principal mechanism of action. Okay? If the principal mechanism of action is pharmacological, the product is not a medical device. Nevertheless, your device can incorporate medicinal substances which act in an ancillary way to your device. Okay? Also, another requirement is infection and microbial contamination. You've got to demonstrate that your device is not in risk of being infected. Also, it can be applicable to sterilize the device or not. That, as I said, is particular case by case, because obviously there are devices that have to be sterilized and other devices are not. It will depend on your device. Also, here we will have all the requirements applicable to all these devices that incorporate materials of human or animal origin. Okay, this in Chapter 2 we will find described what does your device need to comply with in order to demonstrate that it's safe and effective, if it includes materials of human or animal origin. Okay. Also, safe disposal. What does that mean? You've got to demonstrate that it's safe to dispose of your device. That means either retiring it from the patient, or retrieving it from the patient, or throwing it away once you have used it, or throwing it away when for instance, it malfunctions. If you buy a device that has to be sterile and you find out that the packaging is damaged, it's got to be safe to throw it away without a risk to the user, okay, and to the environment, obviously. If it has a diagnostic function, there will be specific requirements you will have to comply with, and you will also have to demonstrate that it's protected against radiation and other risks, environmental risks more than anything, such as heat and vibrations. Everything has to be addressed here. Obviously, if your device has a software, you will have to fulfill with the software requirements. And also you will have to provide here with information regarding active or implantable requirements. Okay, there's specific requirements for active and implantable requirements. That's where we were saying that it was quite important to have those notions of if a device was invasive or it was implantable or it was active or non-active that we were discussing in section 1. Besides determining the classification of your device, they will also imply compliance with certain specific requirements. Okay, your device can be classified as a class 2A depending on if it's active or not, but may be classified as a class 3 according to other rule. That doesn't mean your device doesn't have to comply with the active requirements. It will also have to comply with the requirements for active devices. Okay, even though it has not been classified according to the active device rule. So besides these cases of medical devices, we have the same for in vitro diagnostics. Okay, in the Annex 1 of IVDR, you've got the specific requirements for the for IVDs. Okay, in this case, they are quite different to the medical devices, so it's quite important to make a distinction. Okay, you will have to demonstrate performance characteristics, infection to the end user, sterilization, adequacy of the packaging, for instance. If they include materials of biological origin, they've got to be safe for the user. They also have to be safely disposed, and they have to be protected against radiation, mechanical risk. Also, there are software requirements and measuring functions. So as you see, there are many points that have to be addressed, in particular depending on your device. So it's a quite important exercise to be able to identify which requirements are applicable to your device early on, so as to be able to test as much as you can before performing the technical documentation compilation. So besides these 2 chapters of general requirements and specific design and manufacturing requirements, we've got chapter 3. We have already talked about this chapter. This is the one that talks about the information that has to be supplied by the manufacturer. Okay, as we said, this information should be on the device, and we have seen in detail the instructions for use and the label, what should comply with. As I said, we don't include a list here, an exhaustive list, but if you go to chapter 3 of this annex, you can find each particular information that should be included within the information supplied by the manufacturer. Okay. So once we have identified these requirements, we will have to try to demonstrate compliance with each of the requirements. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to identify the technical standards and reference guidelines that can be used to demonstrate this compliance. Okay. You can also set in-house methods to demonstrate compliance, but usually you'd go first for the standards. Okay. Within the technical standards, we've got two differentiated groups. We've got the harmonized standards, and then we've got the non-harmonized standards. Okay. Harmonized standards have already been reviewed and accepted for compliance of the requirements. That means that the notified body is not going to be wondering whether this standard is applicable or not. Okay, and the non-harmonized standards have not been previously assessed, so it's more likely that the notified body will check if this standard is applicable or it is not. Okay, an important thing to notice here: these harmonized standards are not harmonized under medical devices regulation. They are harmonized under directives. Okay, so that's going to become obsolete in about a year. In next May, it's going to be obsolete for the medical devices, and in May 2022, it's going to be obsolete for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. It is true that there are standards that are planned to be harmonized under the regulation, but it's not. It has not happened yet. They have not been published yet. Okay, so take into account that these harmonized standards are harmonized under MDD, not MDR. Okay. So regarding the non-harmonized standards, here we've got examples of the most common non-harmonized standards. Usually in Europe, the most followed are International Electrotechnical Commission and International Organization for Standardization. Those two are the most common. But then we also have the European Committee for Standardization and the American Society for Testing and Materials. Okay. What you should do is, once you have identified the requirement, you should go to the websites of these entities and find out which standards are applicable to your device, and see which ones you should follow to demonstrate compliance. Okay. Besides the technical standards, there are also plenty of guidance documents. Okay, the most common here in Europe are MEDDEV and MDCG. MEDDEV was guidance according to the directives, while MDCG guidelines are according to the regulations. So with the time, it should be moving towards MDCG. Up until now, you can still use MEDDEV, but with time, you should go switching to MDCG. Okay. Besides that, we've got the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which publishes guidance on several topics, but not just for Europe, but also for other countries. Then we've got the guidance documents of FDA, which are also quite useful, especially when we don't find similar devices or similar guidance for devices in Europe. FDA is a good source of documentation. And we also have a Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute and the World Health Organization. Okay, all these entities publish guidance that can be used to study and validate and test your devices. So once we have done this exercise, we have identified all these requirements and all the standards to demonstrate compliance with the standards. We should prepare general safety and performance requirements checklist. Okay, here you've got an example. What you will do is you will list all of the requirements and you will indicate if it's applicable or no. Here you've got a column saying it's applicable, yes, or it's not applicable, no. And you go signing if it's applicable or not. Okay. If not, you can provide with a justification why it's not applicable. For instance, if you consider that an example is if your requirements for sterilization. If your device is not sterile, you can also say no, because my device is not sterile. Okay. Once you tick as a yes, you have to provide with which standard you are following to demonstrate compliance with. That means you have followed that specific standard. You have done the testing that is listed in that standard to demonstrate that the device complies with the requirement. Okay. Then it's quite common as well to include an additional column indicating the location of the specific report or where the information is within the technical documentation. Okay, here you can see, for instance, references to particular sections of the technical document. Okay. So once you have finished with we have finished with the general safety and performance requirement, let's talk about the risk management of your device. Okay. So risk management is a task that should be performed. It's mandatory to be performed for all devices that have to comply with the medical devices regulation. And what is actually risk management? Risk management is a process to identify, quantify, monitor, and manage the risks that are associated with the life cycle of your medical device. Okay, it's not a process that it's going to end once you place the device in the market. It has to be maintained and updated once you've placed the device in the market. Okay, usually this risk management is performed following the standard ISO 14971, because this is a specific standard for the application of risk management to medical devices. Okay, so as we were talking with the general safety and performance requirements, it's quite easy to imagine you've got a requirement that indicates that you have to perform a risk management activity. You will say it's applicable to your device, and you will list this standard. You will indicate that you're following this standard to comply with the requirement. Okay, that would be an example. So back to the risk management. And you can see that it's quite present in the new regulation. I mean, it's cited quite a lot of times within the regulation. And as I said, it's a mandatory requirement for all the manufacturers to establish, document, implement, and maintain a system for risk management. Okay, as we said before, it's a part of the general safety and performance requirements. Okay, it's important to keep in mind that once you are developing your device, you will have an input of the pre-marketing phase. Once you do the initial testing of your device, you will go identifying particular risks, and you will come up with particular ways to mitigate those risks. But there will also be a super important input, which is the feedback once you have placed a device in the market. Okay? Because there are risks that you might not have identified that will show up afterwards. Okay, we will see a little bit more of this process in detail in a second. So how do we perform a risk assessment? There are three clear steps. Okay, the first one is the recognition of the risks. You've got to establish a context of analysis, and then identify which are the potential risks of your device. Once you have recognized these risks, what you will do is prioritize them. That means that you will have to analyze which are the causes and the consequences. Okay, and once you have analyzed these particular risks, what you will do is you will proceed with the management. That means you will take decisions to try and mitigate or reduce or avoid these risks or the impacts, and you will implement them. Okay, so we have this this pattern. First, as we said, recognition, then prioritization, and management. Okay, this process, as we say, has to be constantly monitored and reviewed. It's not a thing you do once and you forget about it. You have to keep updating your risk management file. It's something that has to be done over and over. It's not something done once and you forget about it. Okay, first you go with the recognition, then you go to the prioritization. In this prioritization, you will try to assess which risk is more likely and which has the worst consequence. Okay, and then you will try to implement decisions to mitigate, reduce, or avoid at all these risks. Okay, so here's what we usually do in a risk evaluation. What we do is we take risk by risk. Each of the risks we identify, all of them from the manufacturing to the writing of the instructions for use, all the points, we assess all the points, and we identify which are the potential risks. Okay, and next what we do is we assign likelihood to these risks. For instance, if it's a risk that is not likely to happen at all, you would give it a 1, that remote. It almost never happens. But on the other hand, if it's something that happens very often, because you found out that this risk happened very often according to your testing, you will give it a score of 5. Okay. Besides the likelihood, you will assess the severity of the consequences. That means what happens once this error is triggered, what happens when this risk really takes place, and you will give it a score depending on the severity of the consequence, which will range from 1 to 5. Obviously, you can change the scores. This depends on the risk management plan of each company. This is just a general example. Okay, so here in this case, 1 would be trivial, like the consequence is not serious. Being 5 are fatal, like the patient dies. Okay, so what you will do to prioritize this risk, to analyze if it's a risk that you have to take into consideration to mitigate it, is you will multiply the scores, like the likelihood multiplied by severity. okay? And you will obtain a score, a final score. This final score is going to tell you if you have to work on mitigation of this risk, or if the risk is acceptable. So for instance, if we have a risk that it's unlikely, let's give it a score 2. But the severity is let's say moderate, a 3. We've got a 6. We should try to reduce this risk because it can happen quite often, and it can have bad consequences. So we have to try to reduce it as much as possible. But let's imagine that it's a risk that it's quite likely and has serious consequences. Obviously, this is going to go to the red area, which is intolerable. So you will have to implement active measures to avoid or reduce uh, this risk. What you will try to do is either implement measures to avoid it from happening or mitigating the consequences. Okay, this will allow you to do a re-evaluation, and the score will go down, because if you implement measures to prevent or mitigate the risk, the new score is going to go down. For instance, if it was a risk that happened recurrently but not frequent, and you manage to reduce it to unlikely, your score will go from 4 to 2. So reducing the final score and allowing you to accept this residual risk. Okay. This just a reminder for what we said before. When there's a residual risk, it should be included in the instructions for use. Okay, if you manage to reduce as much as possible all your risks, but there's still residual risk that the patient or the user should be aware, you still have to include that on the instructions for use. Okay, this is what we were making reference of before. So now let's talk about the product verification and validation. Okay, this section includes quite a lot of subsections, and we're going to talk about briefly about each of them. If you have questions about any of them, we can talk about it in the end. It's okay. So we can see the product validation and verification includes all these sections. Okay, we go through biocompatibility to usability, clinical or performance evaluation, depending on if you have a medical device or an in vitro diagnostic device, sterility of the device, stability of the device, software validation, and admit talks. Okay, here we're going to focus on the first three, but we can say about stability. Usually, you have to perform studies of the stability of your device, particularly taking into account the transport conditions. That is very important to take into account, that it's not just going to be on a shelf. It has to be transported, and you have to make sure that your device is not affected by the transportation conditions. Because I mean, if you're sending it in a plane and it goes in a super cold situation because of the cargo of the plane, you've got to take that into account, that your device might be exposed to such low temperatures, and either you provide with a packaging to keep it stable, or you will have to reassess the stability of your device. Okay, this is particularly important for in two cases. In medical devices, for substance-based products, this is quite important. And in the case of in vitro, in the reagents of the reaction. If you've got several reagents, you've got to make sure that they're stable in several conditions. Okay. In case they're not stable in normal conditions, you should write it down in the label and the instructions for use of your device, so that the user knows that how to store this device so that it keeps stable. Okay. On the other hand, we also have software validation, which is obviously particularly important in standalone software devices, but it's also applicable for devices that integrate a software. Okay, the software has to be validated, and this is something that has been made clear pretty much with the regulation. Okay, the new software concept is all about the regulation, and it has to be taken into account. And this validation should be included in this section of product validation and verification. Okay. What we make reference about is admit talks. This is somewhat of a medicinal product concept. And this is applicable when your product includes absorbable substances or ancillary medicinal substances, okay? Because it's necessary with the regulation now. It's necessary to demonstrate this profile of ADME and tox of the substances, okay? So now let's go one by one. We'll start with biocompatibility. Biocompatibility is most commonly studied with the technical standard series ISO 10993. This is a long series of standards. There are 22 standards in total. And what they do is they analyze each of the aspects of the biocompatibility of the device. Okay, what we're first gonna do in the first standard of this series is categorize the device. Okay, what you will have to do is you identify the nature of body contact of your device. That means you've got to identify if your device is contacting with the surface of the body, or if it's a external communicating device, it goes within and out of the patient's body, or if it's an implantable device. Okay, you have to define this. It's quite similar to the classification according to the rules of the MDR, like saying if your device is invasive or not, but it's not the same. Okay, this classification according this standard ISO is just used for biocompatibility. It's not used for the classification of the device. There are two different concepts. For the classification of the device, you will follow the rules of the regulation, and here for the biocompatibility, you follow the guidance of this technical standard. So besides the nature of the body contact, what you will also do is analyze how long is the device going to be in contact with a patient. Okay, and you will have to define if it's a limited exposure or if it's a prolonged exposure or a permanent contact. Okay, here in contrast to what happened with the classification rules, here you do take into account the cumulative time of exposure. Okay, according to this ISO, it's not the same having a device that it's used 5 minutes a day, but for the rest of your life, than having a device that it's just used once. Okay, it's a different concept. So once you have identified the nature of this body contact and the contact duration, what you will have to do is to assess specific endpoints for biological evaluation. Okay, here you have a list of all the endpoints, which go from physical and chemical information, cytotoxicity, chronic toxicity, genotoxicity. You have them all here. But you will only have to assess particular cases. Okay, depending on your device, you won't be asked. For instance, if it's a device that only enters in contact with the surface of the patient, of the skin, let's say, and it's got limited exposure, obviously you're not going to be asked to perform studies of genotoxicity. Okay, depending on how your device is classified within this ISO, you will find a list indicating, okay, if your device is a surface contact device and has prolonged exposure, you should test all these endpoints of biological evaluation. Okay, so depending on the complexity and the kind of your device, you will have to perform one or the other. It's always possible to provide justifications so as not to do specific testing, but it's got to be supported by previous data or published literature. Okay. So besides this biocompatibility, we've got usability. Usability is a factor that has to be taken into account mandatorily. As we said before, it's one of the general safety and performance requirements of Annex 1. It says that the device has to be ergonomic and user error free. That means that your device has to be easy to use. The user has to understand what it has to do, and the risks of the user misusing the product has to be minimized as much as possible. Okay. This is studied in usability. Usability is studied in accordance with technical standard 62366, okay, which is specific to medical devices. And this the testing of usability of the device particularly aids at indicating that your device complies with the requirement of usability. So what is the process to to study this usability. First, you've got to identify who the intended users are, what the the use environment is, and what is the operation context. We have insisted in this point quite a lot, but it's important to keep in mind who the intended user is. It's not the same developing a device for a lay person than for a doctor. Okay. You also have to take into account the use environment. Where is a device going to be used? Is it going to be used in a hospital? Is it going to be used in a particular clinic? Is it going to be used in a house? It's quite important to define these matters so as to be able to assess if the device is used properly or not. Okay. Then you perform a risk assessment, trying to identify which could be the potential sources of error, like where can the user go wrong? Are my instructions for use complete? Is my device easy to handle? Does it have too many buttons? Are the buttons too big? Are the buttons too small? Those are all risks you have to consider in your risk assessment activity. And then you define the user interface specification, like how is the interface going to be. And then you've got to design studies. Okay, there are two types of studies for usability. You've got formative testing and summative testing. So what is a formative testing? Formative testing is something you do while you are developing your device. Okay, so what you do is you interact with potential users and you let them use your device, and you let them give you their opinion regarding the device, or you give them input on how to use it, and you ask them how they feel about it, how if they think it's easy or not, or what should be changed, considerations that should be taken into account. But this is a formative testing. There's a lot of interaction between the sponsor of the study and the user that is testing the device. Okay. And formative testing is performed during the development. Why? Because it's important to take into account this feedback of usability before you have closed and all the aspects of your device. Because maybe your device acts has an excellent performance, it's very safe, but when the doctor has to use it, he doesn't know how to use it, and then he uses it incorrectly, which leads to bad consequences. Okay, so it's important to have this input, this formative testing, way early in the development. Okay, so as to be able to implement these ideas in the design. Okay, and then the other kind of study is a summative testing. The summative testing is used to demonstrate that the device can be used by the intended user without serious errors or problems. Okay, usually this test consists of recruiting 10 to 15 users and let them use the device without any explanation. You cannot give them a training on how to use the device. You only provide with the instructions for use. And particularly if it's a complicated device to use and you are aiming to provide a training, then yes, you can provide them without specific training. But usually you want to give the user as less information as possible, so as him to be able to use the device without you having to explain every single step. Okay, and this summative testing will be used to demonstrate that the device is user error free. Okay, and this will be summarized in a usability report, which has to be included in the technical documentation. This report is going to be important to demonstrate compliance with the requirements on usability. Okay, as you can see, it's all quite pretty linked. So now let's talk about the clinical evaluation. Okay, there are three concepts we have to keep in mind. We've got clinical evidence, clinical data, and clinical evaluation. What is each thing? Clinical evidence is clinical data and performance evaluation results that pertain to a device of a sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefit when used as intended by the manufacturer. Okay, it's demonstration of it complying with the safety and performance. Then clinical data, we all can imagine what clinical data is, but let's clarify that it means information concerning the safety or performance that is generated from the use of a device and is sourced from either clinical investigations. Let's remember that clinical investigations is the terminology to clinical studies in medical devices. Clinical investigations of the device concerned, clinical investigations or other studies reported in scientific literature. This also can be used for your clinical evaluation. Reports published in peer-reviewed scientific literature or other clinical experience of either the device in question or a device for which equivalence to the device is demonstrated, or clinically relevant information coming from post-market surveillance. Okay, clinical data can come from several places. It doesn't only make reference to data generated in clinical investigations. It can also come from literature, and it can come from post-market surveillance activities. Okay. This has to be kept in mind. And then we've got the clinical evaluation. This clinical evaluation is the systematic and planned process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess the clinical data pertaining to a device in order to verify that the safety and performance are acceptable and comply with the requirements of the regulation. Okay. So what will cover this clinical evidence? What is this clinical evidence going to be used for? It's going to be used to back up the intended purpose, including all the medical indications. It's going to be useful for the clinical performance and benefits. It's going to be used to determine measures for risk avoidance and risk mitigations, the usability of the device for the intended users, the suitability of the supplied information materials, and instructions for target population groups. The clinical evidence is quite used for a lot of points in the clinical evaluation. So how are we going to perform this clinical evaluation? Up until now was performed with the MedDev 27/1 revision 4. It's got to be said that with the regulation, the scope is even broader. So it's performing the clinical evaluation according to this MedDev should suffice, but it's a bit more thorough with the regulation. Let's remember that MedDev was a guidance for directives, not for the regulations. Okay. So it has 5 different stages, ranging from 0 to 4. Okay, which are description of the device and clinical evaluation plan, literature search, evaluation of the data, preparation of the clinical evaluation report. Now we're going to talk about it, about each step one by one. Okay, so worry not. So first, the stage 0, which is the scoping, let's say. Okay, what we're gonna do in this preliminary stage is take into account the description of the device. What are its particular features that can have an impact on its clinical evidence? Let's say, what are the benefits of this device? What are the mechanisms of action? What are the risks associated to this kind of device? This has to be all considered in the scoping. Okay. Also, another fundamental point is the indications for what is going to be the device used. This is something that has to be totally defined. Obviously, you've got to indicate. You've got to take into account once you're doing your clinical evaluation for what is your device being used. It's not the same. For instance, before we had this question regarding the software as a class 1 or as class 2A. Well, depending on the indications, you will have to demonstrate certain performance and certain lack of risks. It will depend a lot on the indication of your device. It's not the same developing software for the diagnosis than a software for the aid in imaging. So obviously the risks are different and that the benefits are also different. So you'll have to assess what are the indications of your device. Another thing to have in mind is the target population, because obviously it's not the same intending the device to a particular subset of population or having it to broad population. Okay, this is something that has to be taken into account. And then you also have to take into account information on equivalent devices. Okay, if there's information of devices that are considered equivalent by the manufacturer, we will talk about equivalency in a second. You also have to take it into account in the scoping. Okay. We also have the state of the art. This is a pretty basic and important point of the clinical evaluation report, because you have to really well assess what is the technology that's being used currently for the indications that you're using your device for. Okay, so this is something that all should be considering in the stage 0, in this preliminary stage of scoping. Okay, so once you have defined this background of the clinical evaluation, what you will do is try to gather as much data related to your device as possible. Okay. On the one hand, you will always have the data that is generated by the manufacturer. Okay, obviously, if you perform as a manufacturer, you perform clinical investigations, you will have all this information. You also have post-market surveillance reports, and you also have complaints and incidents from surveillance activities. Obviously, there's a lot of data that is in the possession of the manufacturer. Okay. On the other hand, you can also use that data retrieved from literature. What does that mean? That means that you can look for published literature that it's related to your device or the indications. This is most commonly used for the background, like saying which are the current treatments for the specific illness I want to treat. Okay, it's got to be data relevant to the subject or to equivalent devices. It cannot be general data, and it's as we were saying, it's quite useful to establish the current state of the art. Okay, it's important when you're doing this literature search to identify and define a protocol. Okay, you've got to be really thorough once you're performing this search to define the protocol beforehand, before starting doing this search. Okay, you will identify which terms are you going to look for, in which databases you're going to look for new information. Okay, how are you going to collect all the information? This is something that has to be done beforehand. Okay, you define this protocol and then you proceed with that data from the literature. It's important to mention that your notified body will ask for the papers, for the articles that you use in your clinical evaluation. That means you cannot base your information on the summary of the article. You need to retrieve this article because the notified body is going to ask for it. Okay, this is I mean it's something obvious, but it should be stated. Okay. So we've been talking about this equivalency. It's important to keep it in mind here. What does equivalence mean? Because when you're looking for information on similar devices, you might consider it's equivalent, but maybe it's not. Okay, so you have to keep it in mind. Equivalency means technical, biological, and clinical equivalence. It's not just that you consider that it's used for the same indication. It's got to be technical, biological, and clinically equivalent. Okay, so what does that mean? From a technical point of view, it means that it has to have a similar design, similar conditions of use, similar specification, similar deployment methods, and similar principles of operation. Okay, it's got to be technically equivalent. From a biological perspective, it means that the materials and substances have to be the same. It has to have a same kind and duration of contact with the patient. It has to have similar release characteristics of substances, including degradation products and leachables. Okay, this is a lot of information that has to be equivalent within the devices. Okay, it does not work as a in the legal framework of United States. It's not the same concept of equivalence. Okay. You've got to demonstrate technical, biological, and clinical equivalence. Clinical equivalence means that it's intended for the same clinical condition, and it's including similar severity and stage of disease at the same site in the body, same kind of user, and similar relevant critical performance in view of the expected clinical effect. Okay, so as you see, it's a lot of information that has to be equivalent. It's quite complicated to demonstrate equivalence. According to regulation, it's not expected to happen really often. It's more or less expected to happen with devices of the very own manufacturer, because they're going to ask you to demonstrate equivalency, and this will not be able to be performed unless you've got an agreement with the other manufacturer. So it's quite complicated. So now that you have identified all the relevant data for your clinical evaluation, what will you do? Well, you will prepare an appraisal plan. Okay, this appraisal plan will take into account the quality of the data. If the data has quality good enough, it will be considered. If not, it will be dismissed. And then the relevance of the data. That means, is it related to my device? Is it related to my, is it really related to my specific indication? Then taking into account these two aspects, the quality and relevance, you will give a value to this data. Okay. For instance, a clinical investigation you have performed with your device for the intended use is going to have a very high score because it's quite relevant to your device. Obviously, it's been specifically tailored to your device, so it has a lot of weight. On the other hand, a publication that is related to the current state of the art of the treatments used for a similar indication to yours, even if it's a super nice publication with a lot of quality, it's not going to be super relevant. So it's not going to have a high score. So which are the most common causes of low data value or significance? Which once you perform this literature search, you usually find out that there's lack of information because you analyze the paper and you find out that the methods are not explained or the clinical outcomes are not thoroughly registered, or the undesirable effects have not been monitored. So this is lack of information in general of the paper you have detected. Improper statistical methods, which means they have statistical power because the clinical investigation has been performed with a sufficient amount of patients, but the statistical methods are not adequate. Then this uh, diminishes the quality of the paper. Also, lack of adequate controls, because that's something that happens quite a lot once you've identified these publications. And also, number two is more for statistical significance. There are also quite a lot of publications that are based on 10 or 20 patients, and obviously that's not enough to justify the safety of your device. Even though if the publication is quite similar, is from a device that can be considered equivalent to your device, and it's being used for the intended use of your device, if the number is too small, it's like it's been used in 10 patients, it won't suffice to claim safety of the product. Obviously, it can be used as a support. That doesn't mean that the publication is not useful. It means that you may still require clinical investigations to be able to market the product. Okay. So once you have identified all this data and you have appraised it, that means that you have given it a score, and this score tells you how much you can rely on this data. You will perform a comprehensive analysis with some methods. Okay, that means you will assess all this data and will come to the conclusion whether of if your device complies with the requirements or no. Okay, if you come out with a conclusion that it doesn't comply with safety and performance requirements, obviously you will have to go through more clinical data. That doesn't mean that the data up until now is bad. It doesn't mean that your device is not safe. Maybe it's just that there is no data enough to justify your the safety of your device, and maybe you have to perform a clinical investigation on your own to demonstrate it. If, on the other hand, you do demonstrate, you consider that it complies with the requirements on safety and performance, you can proceed with the CE marking. Okay. Once you have analyzed all this information, you will write down this clinical evaluation report. Okay. This clinical evaluation report will summarize all the process. You will go like from scoping to identification of data. Where are you retrieving the data from? All these details have to be detailed inside the clinical evaluation report. Sorry. This is you can find guidance on how to do this on the MedDev 2.7, as it indicates every part of the clinical evaluation report and the typical expected sections of your clinical evaluation report. Okay, you've got to make certain that this report contains sufficient information to be read and understood by an independent party. You have to. That means that you have to set a background to the medical device, a description to the device. It's not just including the clinical data within this report, and that's all. Now you've got to place a background so that anybody that reads the report can find out and can agree or disagree with your opinion on the fulfillment of the safety and performance requirements. So the content inside the report shall be cross-referenced to the relevant documents that support them. That means usually here in the final stage of the clinical evaluation report, you have to compare to weigh down the risks and the benefits. Obviously, your outcome should be positive. There should be more benefits than risks. However, you don't perform the risk analysis within the clinical evaluation report. You do it in another section of the technical document. So you have to make a reference from within the clinical evaluation report to ask from where did you obtain the information regarding the risks. Okay. And last, it should include titles and investigational codes if you have performed these clinical investigations. Obviously, this depends on the kind of device, because there are devices that do not require clinical investigations. It depends on the device. Okay. So, and this clinical evaluation report will be included within the section of validation and verification of the device. Now let's going to talk about the last topic is going to be the performance evaluation. Okay, because we were talking about this clinical evaluation report. It is something related to medical devices. Now we're going to talk about in vitro diagnostics. Okay. In the case of in vitro, we do the performance evaluation. Okay. This process is a continuous process in which the data is assessed and analyzed to demonstrate the scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. These are the three pillars of performance evaluation. What does that mean? First, you've got to demonstrate scientific validity. You've got to demonstrate that the biomarker you're using has a scientifically validated correlation with something. Okay, it's associated to an illness or to a disease, for instance. Okay, then you've got to demonstrate that it's possible to analyze this biomarker, its concentration or its expression, and correlate it in a linear way, like response of the biomarker associated with a condition of the disease. And then you have to do a clinical validation. Okay. Let's see. This has changed quite a lot from IVDD perspective to IVDR. Please remember that IVDD is still applicable until 2022. Okay, and IVDR will come fully in force in May 2022. Okay, so what I'm talking about here, which is applicable to regulation, will be fully implemented in 2022. Okay. So according to the directive, there was no this point of scientific validity. This is something that has been introduced with the regulation. Okay. So first we will focus on the assay development. We will perform a study design, the optimization, and the protocol establishment. Then we'll go on to this analytical validation, which is the second step, where we will analyze the sensitivity, the specificity, its linear range, the precision of this biomarker, the accuracy. These are all things that have to be properly validated. This is something particular to IVDs, because obviously in the case of medical devices, you don't have to go through this analytical validation. But as in vitro examination devices, they have to demonstrate that the devices are sensitive, or that they are specific. They only react to certain biomarker, or that they have a linear range. Every of these steps has to be studied and analyzed. Okay, and then we would move on to this third pillar, which was the clinical validation. Okay, the clinical validation will be based mostly on this positive predictive value and negative predictive value. We will test the patients, the samples of the patients, to determine if it's being a correlation between this biomarker and the illness. Okay. So clinical evidence shall be documented in a performance evaluation report. Is an equivalent way to the clinical evaluation report for medical devices. And this report shall include a justification of the approach taken, the literature search methodology and review report. This is something we also did in medical devices. The technology at the base of the device, intended purpose and claims. This is also something we include in medical devices, like describing, it's giving a bit of background of your device. You should also include the nature and extent of the scientific validity, the clinical evidence available to demonstrate compliance with the requirements, and then the new data from post-market performance follow-ups. So, and last, but before the questions, I'm going to try to make it brief. We're going to talk about the post-market surveillance, which is the last section of the technical documentation. Okay. So, what is the post-market? Post-market surveillance are all the activities that the manufacturer is going to be performing once the device is on the market to keep track of his device. Okay. This is something that has to be mandatory performed. It's not something optional. And the manufacturer has to have a post-market surveillance plan in place to be allowed to place this, the document, the device in the market. Okay. So depending on either if we're talking about medical device regulation or IVDR, we would talk about articles 83 to 86 or 78 to 81. Okay. Now let's focus first on the medical devices regulation. We've got three main points, which are the post-market surveillance plan, which will be our protocol of how are we going to gather all this data and how are we going to process it. Then we've got the periodic safety update report, which will be a mandatory report for class 2A, 2B, and 3 devices. And then we also have the post-market surveillance report, which is the one applicable to class 1 devices. In a similar way, we've got the same in vitro diagnostic regulation. Okay, we've got the post-market surveillance plan, and then we've got the PESUR for class C and D devices, and then we've got post-market surveillance report for class A and B devices. Okay. It's important for you, if you're working with medical devices or in vitro diagnostic devices, to familiarize with these terms. Okay, the PMS is the post-market surveillance. Then we've got PSUR, which is periodic safety update report. PMSR, post-market surveillance report, and PMCF, PMPF, which are post-market clinical or performance follow-ups. Okay, the PMS is the activities to gather and track your devices. The PSUR is a specific report that has to be provided for devices of class 2A to class 3 or classes C and D in vitro. The PMSR is a report that has to be provided for class 1 or class AB in vitro. And PMCF, PMPF are activities that are performed after you have certified your device to assess specific questions that were left hanging on your initial clinical evaluation. Okay, it's your commitment to fulfill certain clinical follow-ups once you have marketed your device. So the post-market surveillance plan, what should include? It should include the information on serious incidents that happen related to your device, the records referring to non-serious incidents and data on undesirable side effects, trend reporting information, relevant specialist or technical literature, feedbacks and complaints from the users, and publicly available information about similar devices. That means that your post-market surveillance plan does not only cover what happens with your device, but also is aware of what happens with similar devices. Okay. Besides that, the post-market surveillance plan shall cover at least proactive and systematic data collection process. It has to be really well defined. How are you going to be gathering all this information? Okay, this is something that should be already written down in the PMS plan. Okay. And then you should cover an effective and appropriate methods to assess the collected data. You're also going to have to determine if the data you gather is useful or not, if it's reliable or not. You will have to investigate the complaints and devices for which corrective actions might be necessary. You will have to analyze market-related experience, and the PMS plan has to cover as well communications with competent authorities. That means once you identify potential threats generated by your device, in your post-market surveillance plan, you've got to define how you're going to communicate with the authorities or notified bodies or other economic operators. For instance, your distributor. How are you going to communicate with them to notify this? Okay. Also, additionally, it should have suitable indicators and threshold values for continuous risk assessment. because remember, the risk assessment is not something you perform once, it's something that has to be constantly updated. So your PMS has to gather this information as how is it going to impact on the risk assessment, and it should also include a post-market clinical follow-up, or if there's not a post-market clinical follow-up plan, a justification of why there's not one in place. Okay. With that, it would be all. I'd be glad to answer your questions. If you feel like you can speak, you can openly speak through your microphones. And if you notice I cannot hear you, you can write it down on the chat. I see that there are already questions in the chat, so I'll try to answer those first.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo.
Welcome.
So we have time now, open time to make questions.
Yep.
So if there is no voice, you can start to answer the right questions.
Okay, I see one question here saying that, what is the process for establishing the scope of a clinical study for a class 3 active implantable device? Okay. So first you've got to identify, I mean, when we're scoping, we should define what are the alternatives to your treatment, because that's something really important, especially in class 3. I've got to say that for class 3, it's quite common to be asked to perform clinical investigations. I mean, if there's not sufficient information to back up this this new device, okay? But when you're scoping, you should try to define the state of the art. It's quite important, but particularly the indications of your device. Okay, once this is quite a critical point, and also you should try to identify the competence. It's not well, competence or similar devices, let's say. It's not the same if you try to justify the risks of your device when there is no other good alternative than when you have devices that do more or less the same and have already been CE marked. Okay, so this is quite important to identify once you do this setup. So I see another question here that says, can notified bodies still issue certificates according to the 93 directive? If so, will these certificates become obsolete with the time and will need to be replaced? Okay, yes, they can emit certificates according to Directive 93. More particular in the case of Directive of in vitro diagnostics, because regarding the medical devices, they're kind of running out of time. There are certain notified bodies that already said that they would not be emitting more certificates because they lack of the lack of time. For instance, IEMS is one of them. That they already said that they would not be issuing certificates. But there are other notified bodies that are still issuing these certificates. What happens with these certificates? After a time, they become void. They have to be renewed. Usually happens after 5 years. And yes, then once they become obsolete, they have to be renewed under regulation. So if your device is in a super late stage of development, you have all the data gathered, you have no clinical investigations to perform, no more data to collect, your quality management system is in place, you could try to undergo certification on the directive, which should be easier than with the regulation. However, it is true that notified bodies are already aiming at regulation levels of quality. I mean, they obviously it makes no sense to try to just comply with directive when they also emit certificates according to regulation. Okay, so keep in mind that it's quite important to try and comply with the regulation, which is the new one, let's say. So I see another question here saying, do United Kingdom-based companies need an authorized representative? Yes, they will need an authorized representative. They're considered to be out of the European Economic Area so far. This may change during the negotiations this year, but so far, yes, they have to have an authorized representative in place. See another question over here. Is the clinical evaluation mandatory to class 2A, B, and 3 medical devices? Well, there's got to be quite a lot of data to sustain your claims. Uh, it doesn't mean that it's mandatory to perform clinical investigations, because there might be quite a lot of similar devices to yours that do the same, that are intended for the same illness or disease, which you could use to justify the lack of clinical investigations. It's got to be said, though, that with class 3 and class 2B implantable devices, it's quite common to be asked for clinical investigations, but it's not that it is mandatory. It will depend on how well you can sustain with the data you have gathered the requirement of safety and performance. See another question here. If a device is placed on the surface of an open wound, such as a surgical cut or burn wound, is it still considered simple surface contact? Okay, you've got to, depending on, as a classification rule, no. If it's an open wound, it's not surface contact. In case of the ISO 10993, you should check particularly section 1, which defines what is established as surface or not. But in principle, if it's cut or open wound, it's not considered just surface. I see another question here that says, the quality management system is only necessary for the manufacturing of the IVD or also for the testing? Only the manufacturer has to have this quality management system. Okay, this is mandatory for the manufacturer. But what happens here is, and the tricky part is that the manufacturer will have to audit the other facilities that are related to the devices. Obviously, the facilities that do specific testing already have their certificates to perform testing according to the ISOs that are relevant, or TCPs, CMPs. That's all covered by the facilities that do the testing. Only the manufacturer is the one responsible for having this QMS. Obviously, this QMS should be able to track and monitor the quality of the data that's generated in all the testing for the device. Obviously, if it's done in a facility that has a certification according to certain standard, mentioning this certification should suffice. Okay.
No more questions?
Yeah, I see one more question. Just a second. The last one here. I see. Okay, for the UK, if we organize an authorized representative to sell in the European Union, is there anything else we need to do, or is that sufficient to sell in the United? Okay. Yeah, the authorized representative for sure, but then you would need an importer to bring the product to the European market, and then obviously the distributors and so on. But yeah, the authorized representative for sure, and the importer for sure as well. Obviously, you will have to comply with Sorry, you'll have to comply with all the requirements as laid in the regulation, and obviously there will be an assessment of your technical documentation, and you have to undergo a conformity assessment procedure to be able to place it on the market to obtain the CE marking. But as a manufacturer, you will have to have an authorized representative and some importer. Thank you very much to you all. If you have any questions that for whatever reason didn't pop up now, please feel free to contact me in the email address. And it's been a pleasure.
Okay, thanks Eduardo for your explanation. And now it's time for finish this webinar. So thanks for watching, and hope that this webinar can be useful for our daily work and activity. One more thing, this record will be as soon as possible in our web, in atlantic-getmed.eu. And I hope that you profit this webinar. Thank all for watching.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.